Bias-Based Bullying on Sexual and Gender Minorities, Asian Studies. The presenter is Makiko Kasai. Growing attention is being paid in research and practice to support the lives and experiences of LGBTQ plus people in Western countries. However, not much attention has been paid to the actual situation of LGBTQ plus issues in Asia. Today, many LGBTQ plus youth come out at school, yet individuals commonly experience homophobia and transphobia when victimized, as well as feeling it in the climate of their schools. In this presentation, we focus on LGBTQ plus issues in 4 Asian regions school contexts. We gathered information from Thailand, Hong Kong, China, and Japan. In this study, we summarize the situation in each region from the following 4 perspectives. 1. Student experiences of bias-based bullying and teasing in schools. 2. Teachers' knowledge and experience related to LGBTQ plus issues. 3. Teachers' training program for LGBTQ plus related content. 4. Intersectional bullying and violence towards LGBTQ plus youth in school contexts. In Thailand, 2014 study commissioned by Plan International Thailand on 2070 secondary students found that not only self-identified LGBT students, but also non-LGBT students reported at least one incident of physical, verbal, social, or sexual victimization in school based on perceived anti-LGBT motivations within the past month. Students with self-assessed gender nonconformity reported the highest rate of victimization. In particular, 69% of male students who thought they were less masculine than boys in general reported anti-LGBT victimization, compared with 17% of male students who thought they were as masculine as boys in general. Interviews with teachers suggested they underestimate the number of LGBT students and the victimization these students face. Some thought there were only a handful of LGBT students in their school, whereas in the student survey, 11.9% of all students indicated LGBT identities. To our knowledge, Thai teachers training programs have not been surveyed for their coverage of LGBTQ plus content. However, the fact that until recently, the general secondary school core curriculum of health education covered these topics under the heading of sexual deviation, suggests that most current teachers may have been trained under a pathologizing paradigm. A 2016 review of sexuality education commissioned by UNICEF found that 26% of the 685 surveyed Thai teachers agreed with the statement that sexual relationships with, say, someone of the same sex are wrong. Available information on intersectional victimization is largely anecdotal. For example, Samak Kozam, autoethnography of growing up as a feminine boy in an Islamic religious school, has described how this situation led to specific types of victimization. For example, being ridiculed and told that transgender people go to hell. In Hong Kong, we conducted research with sexually expansive and transgender students on their experiences in sexuality education, identified the following themes. 1. Left out, being omitted and silenced. 2. Terrified and distressed, being misgendered and misinformed. 3. Outraged, being pathologized and bullied. 4. Empowered, connecting trans, inclusive, and rights-based education. 5. Affirmed and supported, engaging in trans-inclusive dialogue. We also interviewed teacher allies with the following suggested training for educators to support LGBT plus students. 1. Government taking a lead to start teacher training officially. Educators reported a need for dedicated teacher education and training in sexual and gender diversity issues under the auspices of Education Bureau. Reconsidering assumptions. Teachers believe that training should provide a space for teachers to become more aware of their own sexual prejudice and to re-examine their assumption about sex, gender, and sexuality. They were conscious of the fact that the social exclusion of sexual minorities is therefore underpinned by both family values and religion. Therefore, training curricula should raise educators' awareness of cultural forces. 3. Engaging with relevant cultural knowledge and skills. Teachers describe the usefulness of cultural knowledge of, in facilitating their understanding and the support they provided to sexual and gender minority students. Learning about inclusive language would equip teachers with the skills to more fully engage with students. Gender-neutral language relevant to the Chinese culture context was suggested. And 4, using dialogue as an education training strategy. Informants suggested that panel presentation by sexual and gender expansive members clarifying myths be helpful in understanding gender and sexually expansive cultures, reducing prejudice and forming alliances to promote equal opportunities for students. Accurate content about sexual diversity should be incorporated into the training curriculum with sexual and gender inclusive lenses. Intergroup contact can be added as training strategies. In mainland China, a study including from 18 secondary schools across the nation found that LGBT students reported higher risk of being bullied and bullying others at school than heterosexual peers. And the study discovered among 751 sexual minority students reported to be called named, verbally threatened, isolated by their peers, and physically threatened because of their minority identities. Penn and colleague indicated among 319 transgender and gender non-binary adolescents, 76.6% reported that they had been abused and bullied because of their sexual and gender minority identities from classmates and teachers. Therefore, it is not surprising to find that Wei and Liu indicated that most Chinese schools were not inclusive for LGBTQ students. The 732 LGBTQ students from their study reported there is a lack of LGBTQ specific school policy, teacher training, and curriculum. The implementation of sexuality education in middle school in China, presented by UNESCO and UNFPA, pointed out that 20.1% of teachers who provided sexuality education reported feeling uncomfortable, and 15.9% reported having not covered their topics of sexual and gender diversity. When responding to belief of sexual relationship with same-sex partner, 32.9% indicate they believe it is wrong, and 37.6% stated they are not sure. Due to limited understanding of sexuality education among teachers and lack of support to teachers, UNESCO and UNFPA recommended to integrate sexuality education into pre-service and in-service teacher training, including identifying and supporting the development of quality teaching and learning resources. The government needed to develop a national curriculum standard for sexuality education, and schools are recommended to establish a curriculum schedule for sexuality education. In Japan, the amount of societal attention being paid to sexual and gender minorities has increased recently. For example, same-sex partnership and medical and psychological issues for sexual and gender minorities are being discussed in the news and TV programs. According to data from 2019, more than 90% of people know what LGBT means, but only half of them understand it correctly. More than 80% of students have heard and experienced bullying and harassment related to sexual and gender minority in school. According to research by Hiraka, approximately 70% of LGBTQ plus students have experienced prejudice and discriminatory remarks during their school years. Some schools have tried to pay closer attention to LGBTQ students, but still schools remain an unsafe place for them. About teachers' knowledge and experience related to LGBTQ plus issues in Japan, Hiraka showed that 77.5% teachers have never taught about LGBTQ plus in class, and reason for that was they felt no need to teach. Kasai also showed that 98 0.1% of teachers knew the meaning of sexual minority, but 93.4% of them felt they are knowledgeable enough to teach. Moreover, 37.3% of teachers had a previous experience of dealing with LGBT students, and 96.7% are willing to dealing with those students in the future. In these days, more and more students started to come out in their younger ages, and in response to this situation, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology released a statement on sexual minorities in 2012 and 2015, pointing to the need to pay close attention to their safety at school. Some schools have tried to incorporate LGBTQ plus issues into classrooms and shift their value system from heterosexualism, cisgenderism to more diverse perspectives. Though Japanese society may not appear diverse at first glance, a number of foreigners living there has increased. However, many minority issues remain unsolved in Japanese society. The current period may be one that will see change in Japanese society from one where it regards itself as a mono society to a more diverse society. Conclusion. This presentation showed experiences, insights, and evidence from researchers and practitioners in 4 Asian regions who have researched or practiced LGBTQ plus issues in school context. As 4.1, in Thailand, about 1/4 of non-LGBT students also reported anti-LGBT victimization in the past months, suggesting that mere perception of a student being LGBT are associated with victimization. We do not know whether this is similar in other countries, as different types of questionnaires are used in each country to highlight the problem. It should be necessary to conduct international comparative research in a uniform format longitudinally. As for point 2, although no standard research has been carried out in each country, it seems that teachers' knowledge is still limited and they do not have a deep and up-to-date understanding of LGBTQ plus issues. As for point 3, compared to other minority issues, there has not been sufficient training for pre-service, on-service teachers. However, some pioneering practices to train teachers have been done and further development is expected. As for point 4, little attention has been paid to intersectionality and conflict between sexual minorities and other minorities. We need to investigate issues such as those reported in Thailand. By exchanging our expertise and experiences, we aim to contribute to further improvement in supporting LGBTQ plus children and adolescents. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Holt, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I wish I was there in person. I was 2 years ago and really enjoyed the conference, but I'm glad we can still get together, even if virtually. Today, I'll be presenting on behalf of my team a study called Bias-Based Bullying Among Transgender and Non-Binary Adolescents, Associations with Psychological and Educational Functioning. This study reflects a collaboration between myself and others at Boston University, as well as includes Sabra Katz-Wise, who's a faculty member at Harvard Medical School, Boston Children's Hospital. In terms of the presentation overview today, first, I'll be briefly overviewing key literature. Second, I'll be talking about results from the pilot longitudinal study, Project Avant, of transgender and non-binary adolescents. And finally, I will be closing with implications, particularly in terms of thinking of how schools might modify their context to better support transgender and non-binary adolescents. In terms of setting the stage, we can first think about prevalence estimates, which are lacking when it comes to youth who are gender diverse. What we do know from the literature is between 0.7 to 2.7% of adolescents identify as transgender. In addition, 0.3 to 1.8% of youth identify as non-binary. We know from the literature that gender diverse youth are at greater risk for a host of victimization forms, including being bullied at school, being threatened or injured with a weapon at school, and sexual dating violence. For all of those, between a quarter and a third of gender diverse youth report these experiences. Another study found that transgender and genderqueer adolescents were more likely to be classified as poly victims than their counterparts. And poly-victimization here being defined as having been exposed to a number of victimization exposures, which we know is linked to more deleterious effects for adolescents. When we think about bias-based harassment specifically, which is the focus of today's study, that is harassment based on one's identity. And a handful of studies have explored this for gender diverse adolescents. Price and colleagues found that sexual minority and gender minority youth, as well as heterosexual youth of color, report as the highest rates of identity-based bullying compared to other youth. In addition, Norris and Ochowski in 2020 found that transgender and sexual minority youth reported both more peer and dating victimization than their peers. And as you'll see from this slide, this included multiple forms, from sexual harassment to physical dating violence. In addition, transgender and gender nonconforming youth are more likely to be victimized based on their gender or gender expression than their cisgender peers. And finally, and to note, differences do exist by gender identity subgroup. That is, not all gender diverse youth are part of a single monolithic group. So for example, genderqueer non-binary youth with a male sex assigned at birth reported more bullying victimization than transgender or LGBTQ cisgender youth with a male sex assigned at birth. And so understanding those subgroup differences is really important. In terms of well-being, we know that significant disparities exist for gender diverse youth. Some examples are displayed in this slide. Almost 60% of transgender students report depressive symptoms, with 21% of cisgender students reporting such symptoms. 1 in 3 trans youth have attempted suicide. In terms of feeling safe on the way to or from school, which is a context that many adolescents are in, 26.9% of transgender youth reported feeling unsafe in those contexts, compared to under 10% of cisgender male and females. And finally, for lifetime alcohol use, it is more common, as you will see here as well, among transgender than cisgender male or female teens. In terms of why such disparities exist, the minority stress framework, which was originally developed to describe the experiences of sexual minority individuals, has been extended to consider the experiences of gender diverse individuals. So this postulates that individuals who hold marginalized minority identities in society experience a number of distal and proximal stressors, and this leads to increased rates of physical and mental health concerns. And a recent systematic review by Tankersley et al. In 2021 found particular evidence for those with diverse gender identities that documented links between victimization experiences, discrimination and abuse, and mental health concerns. Contextual factors, as was stated in the minority stress framework, are critical. And so for youth, we can think about a couple of levels, just as illustrators of contexts that youth are in that may shape their experiences. At the school level, based on a Human Rights Campaign report for students in United States schools, only 1 in 3 trans youth are called by their actual name at school, and only 1 in 3 can express themselves in a way that fully reflects their gender identity. Further, half of trans youth are not able to use restrooms that match their gender identity. And this is as part of a backdrop at the larger US state and federal policy level. So for example, in 2017, the Trump administration rescinded Title IX aspects that protect the rights of transgender individuals. In a more positive policy level, in 2018, Wisconsin affirmed the right to non-discriminatory healthcare coverage for transgender state workers. Context is very important when we consider the experiences of transgender and non-binary adolescents. In terms of protective factors, family support has perhaps been the factor that's explored most fully, with a handful of studies finding that more family support was related to better outcomes for gender diverse youth. For example, one study found that parent support was related to greater life satisfaction and fewer symptoms of depression. A number of studies have considered social transitioning as a proxy for support. And in those studies, two of which are indicated here, trans youth who had socially transitioned didn't exhibit the same levels of depression and anxiety and self-worth as seen in other samples of trans youth. And authors in both cases postulated that the social transition was a proxy for having those key aspects of support in their lives. Less research has looked at peer support, but Shaw, one of the authors of this paper, has a qualitative manuscript in progress that highlights the salience of peer support for transgender and non-binary adolescents in particular. Eisenberg also highlighted and explored a number of other internal assets, student-teacher relationships, family connectedness, and safety in the community. But to date, there's been less work focused on protective factors overall. So gaps in the research to date on the experiences of transgender and non-binary adolescents include a reliance on clinic-based samples, considering gender minority adolescents as a homogeneous group, and focus on identifying risks without considering these strengths and protective factors. So we build on that study through the following research questions. First, what is the prevalence of bias-based harassment among a national sample of TNB adolescents? Similarly, what are well-being correlates of bias-based harassment within the sample? And what factors are protective against TNB adolescents who've experienced bias-based harassment? Turning to our study, this was a study in which we recruited adolescents across the United States through social media ads that directed them to the study's website. In the top right corner, you can see an example of one of the ads that was used. These ads were placed on Facebook and Instagram and so forth. And participants were told they'd be compensated for their time. I'll show you some details about surveys in a moment, but there was an online survey that covered demographics, bias-based harassment, well-being, and protective factors. Our sample included 254 transgender and non-binary adolescents aged 14 to 18. They were predominantly white and almost all identified as sexual minorities. The measures are shown here for the study. We used the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Screener 2 for anxiety, the PHQ-2 for depression, the Psychological Sense of School Membership Scale to assess school connectedness, the multidimensional scale of perceived social support for family and peer support, and from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey took items on self-harm, school safety, alcohol use, and vaping. First, turning to the prevalence of bias-based harassment. As you will see here, 3 bars are shown: blue for trans female, red for trans male, and green for non-binary. And in future iterations, we'll divide non-binary into male and female sex-assigned birth. What you can see here is all groups experience a high level of bias-based harassment due to sexual orientation, gender expression, physical appearance, and gender, as well as religion. So in most cases, over half participants report these exposures. We think about what are the well-being correlates of these forms. First, just taking a step back and looking at indicators of mental health, you can see here that the majority of youth met cutoffs for depression, anxiety, and self-harm. And in this case, trans males reported the most psychological distress across the board. Turning to links to bias-based harassment, with the red being not having experienced bias-based harassment in that domain, and the blue being have experienced. The other way around, red being you have experienced that form of harassment and blue being you have not. You can see across every form of harassment, if you have been exposed to it, you report more depression. And then in the next slide here, we see the parallel findings exist for anxiety as well and self-harm. In terms of school functioning, you can see that 15% feel unsafe to and from school, and approximately half live in their affirmed identity and use their chosen name at school. In this case, we also see that if you are exposed to bias-based harassment, your perception of school being safe is diminished. And this last slide in this domain shows the percent living in affirmed identity. And you can see whether you lived in or did not live in your affirmed identity at school does not have a strong association with bias-based harassment exposures. Next, turning to substance use indicators. About 28% used an alcoholic beverage in the past 30 days, and about 18% used a vaping product. Lower substance use rates were found for non-binary compared to transgender adolescents. Here we see a similar pattern as we did in mental health, although rates are lower, where those exposed to bias-based harassment report more alcohol use than those not exposed, as well as more vaping use. Finally, turning to protective factors. Here we're interested in running regression models with outcomes listed here based on bias-based harassment predictors, family, peer support, and school connectedness as the second set of predictors, and then interaction terms where appropriate to test moderation of the protective factors with the bias-based harassment indicators. Unfortunately, we did not find any moderator effects to be significant here. I display the statistically significant predictors for depression, anxiety, self-harm, binge drinking, and vaping. For self-harm and vaping, there were no statistically significant predictors once all of these independent variables were included in the models. For others, you'll see that there are 1 or 2 predictors, except for anxiety, where there are 3 significant predictors. I do want to note that although moderation effects were not significant, protective factors do matter. So a more positive school climate and greater family support were associated with less bias-based harassment based on sexual orientation, as one example. In addition, separate analyses that aren't shown here did confirm that for each protective factor, it was associated with fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety, as we might see in a general population of adolescents. And peer support was related to less alcohol use. And also harassment exposures matter. So all the forms of bias-based harassment were sort of associated with reports of more distress and substance use. To summarize, I know I'm out of time almost. The majority of transgender and non-binary adolescents reported bias-based harassment. It was associated with compromised well-being, and we saw main effects for social support and school connectedness. So what can schools do? Clearly, this suggests that schools should be implementing school-wide programs targeted at reducing bias-based harassment. They highlight the importance of gender-affirming policies, of building systems of peer support, and having structural supports in place to support teens. And you'll see 2 quotes in the bottom from participants in this project that engage in open-ended questions that speak to the importance of schools as a context to potentially promote or which could thwart well-being. And I am just out of time, so please see this slide for any additional questions. And for those of you attending right now, as this is being shown, I look forward to hearing your questions and having conversation with you. Thank you.
Welcome to this oral session entitled Bias-Based Bullying, an European Cross-National Study. My name is Salvatore Ioverno, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Sociology of Ghent University. Today, in this video, I'm going to present some preliminary analysis from the pre-project, an European study on the experiences of LGBTQI students. That means students who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex. But first, let's introduce some concepts and findings from the research about bias-based bullying. With this term, we define a form of bullying motivated by victims' actual or perceived identity, such as LGBTQI identity. It is now well known in research that LGBTQI youth are more at risk for bullying victimization than non-LGBTQI students. And this is very critical, considering that bullying victimization is associated with several negative mental health outcomes and poor school achievements. And the effect is even worse when bullying is motivated by prejudice. According to the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, there is a significant variation on the prevalence of bias-based bullying in Europe. And this map represents the percentages of youth aged 15 to 24 experiencing bias-based bullying often or always. As you can see from the map, the prevalence ranges from 20% to 43%. The top three countries were Greece, UK, and Spain, and at the bottom of the ranking were Denmark, Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Malta. One way to explain the different prevalences of bias-based bullying across Europe is looking at the availability of school resources. Research has identified several strategies to prevent bias-based bullying, and some of those are inclusive anti-bullying policies, inclusive sexuality education, inclusive curricula, the presence of professional teacher training on LGBTQI issues, and the presence of school clubs for LGBTQI students. Also for school resources, there is a significant variation across Europe, and this map provided by the IGLIO organization represents a benchmarking of existing school policies that are inclusive of LGBTQI students' educational rights. And out of the countries reviewed in 2019, Malta, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Spain provided most of these policies, while those countries in red have failed to implement any of the measures. So taken together, the existing knowledge on the experiences of the European LGBTQI students at school has been truncated due to several notable limitations. So first, more studies on the specific experiences of LGBTQI students are needed in Europe. Much of the research is coming from the US, and sometimes it's difficult to apply findings from the US context to the different European contexts. Third, there are a few European studies on the impact of inclusive policies. And finally, how cultural differences across European countries affect LGBTQI students' experiences is understudied. With the Fostering the Right to Education in Europe project, we try to address some of these limitations. As already mentioned, the FREE project is a cross-national study on the experiences of LGBTQI students in 13 different European countries. Data are still being collected through an online survey disseminated mostly through social media and local organizations. The main objective of this presentation is providing information on the prevalence of bias-based bullying, on the differences on general bullying between LGBTQI and non-LGBTQI students, on the prevalence of school resources for LGBTQI students, and on the associations among school resources and bullying experiences. The preliminary analysis will use data from 11 countries. The total analytical sample included about 10,000 participants. So the age average was 16, and on average across the 11 samples, 6% belong to an ethnic minority, about 80% belong to the low to middle social class, and 77% self-identified as LGBTQI. Here, we also disentangled the different sexual orientations and the gender identities, just to give you a general idea about how diverse are the different samples across Europe. For this presentation, we selected two measures of bullying experiences. One is the bullying victimization scale, a 7-item scale measuring experiences of general bullying victimization. We also used 2 single follow-up questions asking how often the causes of the bullying episodes were based on sexual orientation or gender expression. With this graph, we present the prevalences of bias-based bullying. So regarding bullying based on sexual orientation, we can see that the prevalence ranges from 20% in Belgium and Portugal to about 60% in the UK, while in the other countries, the average was about 30%. The rates of bullying based on gender expression tended to be higher on average compared to the bullying based on sexual orientation. The highest rates were again in the UK, followed by Greece and France, whereas the lowest rates were in Portugal. In the other countries, the average was again 30%. This graph represents the prevalence of general bullying victimization among both LGBTQI and non-LGBTQI students. The prevalence among LGBTQI students ranged from 40% to 70%, and among non-LGBTQI students, the prevalence ranges from 30% to 60%. So overall, there is an average of 15 points difference between LGBTQI and non-LGBTQI students. And taken together, LGBTQI students tend to report significantly higher levels of bullying victimization. In addition to bullying experiences, we also investigated the presence of school resources. We assessed teacher inclusiveness with a 4-item scale, measuring to what extent participants perceived that their teachers were accepting of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and gender nonconforming boys and girls. We also examined whether students received any sexuality education in school and whether it was inclusive of different sexual orientation. We examined whether LGBTQI topics were addressed in the classroom during a lesson or a discussion. And we also asked whether the representation were negative, mixed, or positive. And finally, we examined whether the participants were aware of any anti-bullying policy in their school or any inclusive anti-bullying policy. Regarding teacher inclusiveness, we can see that teachers tend to be more inclusive in Portugal and Spain. They are moderately inclusive in Austria, Belgium, and Croatia, whereas in the other countries, they tend to be less inclusive. Considering sexuality education, we can see from this graph that the majority of the students in Croatia and Italy did not receive any. In Spain and France, about half of the samples did not receive sexuality education. And among those who received sexuality education in Croatia, Greece, Italy, Slovenia, and UK, a very small number of students reported that it was inclusive. In the remaining countries, between 25% and 30% of students reported receiving a comprehensive sexuality education. Regarding the presentations of LGBTQI issues, we can see in this graph that in Slovenia, the majority of students reported that no representation was given in class. In Croatia and Greece, we see worrying percentages of students reporting negative representations of LGBTQI issues in class. So Croatia, Greece, Slovenia were also the countries where students reported the least positive representation of LGBTQI issues. In the other countries, a positive representation ranged from 27% to 37%. Finally, from this graph, we can see that the majority of the students were not aware of anti-bullying policies in their schools. Particularly worrying were the percentages in Austria and Slovenia, and among those who reported the presence of such policies across the different countries, only a small percentage reported that those policies mention words such as sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Our final objective was to examine the associations of school resources with bullying experiences. So we used 3 multi-level analyses to take into consideration that students were nested within countries, and we also controlled for students' demographics, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Results show that students who reported more teacher inclusivity were between 20 and 30% less likely to experience both bias-based and general bullying. The presence of general sexuality education was not significantly associated with any of the outcomes. However, the presence of inclusive sexuality education resulted in about 20% reduced odds of bias-based bullying experiences. As I also expected, students reporting a negative representation of LGBTQI issues were about twice as likely as students who did not report any representation to experience bias-based bullying and general bullying. On the contrary, a positive representation is associated with less both bias-based bullying and general bullying by between 20 and 30%. So interestingly, Those who reported a mixed representation were between 20 and 30% more likely to be victims of bias-based bullying. So one possible explanation is that in a mixed representation, the negative arguments tend to be more visible, and thus they may not be sufficiently enough to counterbalance the positive arguments. Thus, a mixed representation may not be sufficient to raise awareness about LGBTQI issues, and students may be more likely to hold their prejudice if they have one in these particular situations. Finally, contrary to our expectations, we didn't find any significant associations between anti-bullying policies and any of the others. So here we present some of the takeaway messages based on the last results. So it seems pretty clear that support from teachers is critical to promoting the safety and the well-being of LGBTQI students. Teachers indeed influence pro-social classroom norms both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, such as when providing a positive representation of LGBTQI issues in class, and directly when being inclusive and accepting of LGBTQI youth. The results also suggest that a positive representation offers opportunities for students to understand the experiences related to different sexual and gender identities, to reduce the tolerance for prejudicial attitudes, and to raise awareness about the seriousness of bias-based bullying. So taken together, teacher training to increase knowledge about LGBTQ issues is particularly important. Results also suggest that a comprehensive sexuality education may help to raise awareness of gender and sexual diversity and improve school climate. And finally, the non-significant associations of anti-bullying policies may suggest that students are often unaware of safe school policies, and unaware students may feel less assured of support by their school communities. So a key strategy may be disseminating information about school policies so students understand public policies affecting their daily environments. So this was my presentation, and I want to thank all our collaborators who supported this project and who worked on this project. But most of all, I want to thank all the students who participated and supported the free project. So thank you for attending this session. I'm leaving with some comments from the participants in their native language. Thank you again.